myself. Hello, everybody. Is there a floating ball in space in front of you? Excellent. This is a good way to start then. Hi, my name is Meaghan, and I have been, I guess, a mentor and friend and invited with gratitude to be part of the Comox Youth Climate Council's meetings. And that's been great. And when we were talking about World Water Day, of course, that's a topic of particular passion and interest. And because we've recently done some watershed presentations work, I was really, just delighted to be able to offer a little bit of time to everyone and to this event today. So I'm pretty excited. And I think what I'll do on that theme I was referring before of sending a backup presentation around in case I was abducted by aliens. I'm still here and still have my presentation, but I have decided to do the world view. And it's always good when we're talking about water, I think, to be able to maybe zoom back and look at ourselves on this blue ball floating through space with an infinite, in an infinite space with a very finite amount of water that sustains us all. And those of us, who understand that the finite nature of water knows that as far as drinking water goes, it's even a smaller amount that's available to us as a resource on the planet. And there is something about that beautiful, shiny blue ball that gives us a moment to pause and reflect on where we are. So if we spin that planet around, we'll get to North America, and then we'll be able to zero in on where we are and where we're grounding our water conversation today. How is my screen? There we go. So this is where I want to land now. And this is Quinish. And building on the wonderful acknowledgement also, and this is another really neat thing. I have been really delighted with this group and the way that your Indigenous acknowledgement is done. I think it's extremely, I think it's really courageous, and it pushes boundaries, and I've been really appreciative of the way that your organization does that acknowledgement. I just really want to say that. So this is Quinish. Another reminder that we're gathered here on the unceded territory of the Comox First Nations. And the Quinish looms large in the landscape. It's the great white whale. It is the grounding or the symbolism of the local flood story. And these flood stories exist all around the planet because the waters of the planet have risen and fallen in successive times, and different cultures in different places around the world all have stories as it relates to the flood. And our local one is Quinish. And I think it's also a real inspiration for us, and perhaps a place where we reflect on the changes that we're also seeing in water and climate and in our relationship with the planet. But today we were talking about watersheds, and I thought, well, let's maybe start just by reminding ourselves, what a watershed is. And essentially a watershed is a space where everything wet, all the water that falls on that land within a certain boundary, all flows towards a common body of water. So in our case, that common body of water is the Salish Sea. And you'll see a watershed divide here, and then there's tributaries and forests and creeks and all of these things that feed into that single body of water. And here's another example. It's a little bit low res, but I liked it because in some ways it made me think of Courtney, because I saw the little bridge there, which could be the 17th Street Bridge or 5th Street Bridge. It also shows like the urban areas as well as farming areas, and then bears and recreators out in the forest. So I think this one in some ways really is expressive of what our watershed looks like. But when you talk about watersheds, you can actually talk about it like on a continental level. Canada itself has all of these continental watersheds that flow into different oceans. So our watershed, or our portion of the continent, flows into the Pacific Ocean. And then you can zoom down into larger bioregions. It's like Russian dolls. It's like watershed within watershed within watershed. So we have this like continental watershed, and then we can go down into the Salish Sea Watershed, which is the Strait of Georgia and Strait of Juan de Fuca. And if I get my little mouse in here, and there we are, just tucked in there in the Salish Sea Watershed. And then we can sort of go a little bit closer in, and this is actually a couple of watersheds. If you start to look at the traditional territory of the Comox First Nation and the boundary that goes all the way up to Sayward, and as you see there, all the way south towards Qualicum, because these boundaries, of course, don't follow jurisdictional or local government lines. They follow a landscape where people passed through and moved through and shared space for millennia. And then here's a really simple version of just kind of looking at ours, kind of looking west, and there's the Comox Glacier, and each one of those blue lines actually represents a pretty, important system where if you look here on the left of your screen, we've got the Trent River, and up here we've got the Upper Puntledge River, and this over here is the Crookshank, and down here is the Lower Puntledge, and this beautiful little sort of palm frond here or something is Morrison Creek. And so it's another way to just get a glimpse at, if you think about where do we live and what is the edge, what's the container that holds us all ecologically and water-wise. And in this case, there's a really great sort of snapshot of that. And then this is another way to look at our watershed. And this is really, we're going to come back to this when we're talking about upper, middle, urban, and shoreline and estuary. So this map shows the orange line is the watershed boundary. And the upper watershed is a lot of the stuff in that upper orange boundary, because that is the drinking water watershed boundary. So this is another container of the Russian Dals. So you have your bioregion, but then you have these smaller ones that are drinking water watersheds. And so that orange line actually represents all the water that falls on that landscape, flows into Comox Lake, and then flows out to become the drinking water for over 45,000 residents of the Comox Valley. And if you count Perseverance Creek, another 5,000 residents of Cumberland. So this is a pretty important aspect of life in the Comox Valley, right? This picture. And here's a beautiful picture of the watershed. And what I want to do is just kind of give you guys a bit of a history of where we've gotten to as it relates to our behavior on the land as colonists on the landscape, the impacts we've had on our watershed, and then some cool stories about how organizations and community are transforming that space. Now, a bunch of you may know, especially if you're into dinosaurs, which I am, that we, between 70 and 90 million years ago, we're actually all underneath a warm, salty, shallow sea filled with swimming elasmosaurs. It's another thing that, zoom out to space, looking at the Earth is a really good, sort of reminder of our smallness and the nature of space. And I think when we look at the pictures of the elasmosaurs, perhaps we're reminded of our smallness in the continuum of time. There's been a lot of amazing things that have covered this landscape over time. It's really important also when talking about this landscape, to acknowledge that for thousands of years, the Comox Valley watershed has been occupied by Indigenous people, and that this watershed has also formed a path between the west and east sides of Vancouver Island. So our watershed, the Comox Valley, and that connection over to Port Alberni is all really strongly connected to how people moved through Vancouver Island and through the landscape before colonization. But let's get to colonization, because that's where things definitely started to go sideways. So I'm going to introduce you to a couple of things really quickly. The first is that little symbol there, which is for the Hudson Bay Company. And the Hudson Bay Company at one point in the 1850s was given a land grant for all of Vancouver Island. And their job was to extract resources and get it ready for settlement. There was no real acknowledgement that anyone already lived here. There was no value placed on water or land or animals other than economic value, the value through sale. And this guy on the left is a guy named Robert Dunsmuir, who worked for the Hudson Bay Company. And the reason why he's important to the story of our watershed and the story of Vancouver Island is because when British Columbia was joining Confederation, joining Canada, he received a land grant of 2 million acres in exchange for building a railway from Esquimalt to Nanaimo. And so if you look at the dotted line on this map, this is all the land that he was given. And he was given not only the land, but all the waterways, the lakes, the rivers. It was all from the spine of Vancouver Island mountain range all the way down to the shoreline. So everything since the 1870s on the southeast quadrant of Vancouver Island has been private property, but not just private property, because in a lot of other places, lakes and rivers are still owned by the Crown or by the government. But in this case, even the lakes and rivers and waterways. And this is a really important part of our collective water story on Vancouver Island. So check out that map, look where we are, and realize that we're in the middle of this huge private land grant. So some other things that happened early on is communities like Cumberland were established in the 1880s, and that's in the watershed, and coal mining began. This is out at number 4, which is right at Comox Lake, where tons and tons and tons of coal was extracted. Boy, did we contribute to climate change as a community. There's so much coal was shipped all over the world and used in ships and in trains for steam engines. And we've definitely done our part here in the Comox Valley to contribute to global CO2 emissions. That's why we're all doing really good work now, right? To turn it around. That coal would go down to Union Bay, and there were huge piles. This is called coke, which is the what's left behind after the impurities are burned off of the coal. So there'd be all these piles of waste down in Union Bay. This was up in Comox Lake. So around 1927, there were floating camps on Comox Lake, and it was, you know, the entire Comox Valley was really built on logging and coal mining initially, and then farming down in sort of the lower areas. It was a very important part, and most people who lived here worked in those industries. And a lot of big trees got pulled out of this watershed. In fact, all of the big trees got pulled out of this watershed. And in particular, these trees were pulled out around the mouths of creeks and rivers and streams. And this is a really important part of the story, because as soon as you remove large trees from the mouths of rivers and creeks and streams, it becomes very, very difficult for vegetation to reestablish itself, right? Because the water is flushing through. Those trees play a role in the mouths of rivers in slowing flow. And so in this process of logging on Vancouver Island, which was super integral to who we were as a community, we did some pretty serious damage to our creeks and streams. This is when the dam went in on the Puntledge River. So this, from a water perspective, separated Comox Lake from the ocean. So if you think about salmon spawning and the connection between Comox Lake and the ocean, we severed that, as we have in many places around the world with dams. And this is where the lumber was taken down to Royston. And Royston was actually one of the largest log booming grounds in the world. And all the wood that was coming out of the Comox Valley watershed, most of it was being shipped over and was used to essentially build Vancouver. It went to mills in New Westminster and Vancouver, and it was like epic landscape in Royston. Farming was right on the heels of coal mining and settlement and expansion. You can see that landscape again and look back and see, looking at the watershed. People had to clear land for farming, so they were given dynamite to blow up the stumps from the logging, because it's really hard to manually remove stumps from the landscape. So people had dynamite to blow up these stumps so we could, so they could make a living and support their families and grow food. Forest fires were a huge part of this landscape. This was the big fire in Merville in 1922, and there was another one further up in Oyster River in 1938. This is another like sort of classical postcard of the farm country of the Comox Valley, and gives you, again, looking back at the glacier, this view, the ways that we've impacted the watershed. And this is the Courtney River. It's almost unrecognizable. This is from 1900. So if you think about it, on the left side is the city of Courtney, like Courtney side, on the right-hand side would be where Kuskusum and those other, the Hollyhock Flats and those locations. And this would be feeder bluffs along the coast that feed into places like Goose Spit and Tree Island. So like Point Holmes around the corner would be Point Holmes. So that's like this is some interesting sort of things about the landscape and the way that we've lived and impacted and interacted. So I'm gonna just jump right into the upper watershed, because we're gonna do this in 4 chunks. So remember, back at the map, so we're looking kind of up more in the drinking water watershed, this orange line for the upper watershed. And this is another way to look at it. And there's some stuff really to recognize, like Perseverance Creek watersheds right around Cumberland. So that's something I'll talk about a bit more. But like the Crookshank Canyon, Crookshank River watershed is here. These are all sub watersheds that flow into Comox Lake. So we're actually in relationship with all these places too, that include Strathcona Park. And the glacier. We always come back to the glacier because that sits at the top, right, of the upper watershed, and is this like symbol, this sort of crown on the Comox Valley, you know, ecological and water landscape. The upper watershed is also home to some really beautiful ecological areas. This is an ecological reserve on Comox Lake. This is Coal Beach, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's on the east end of Comox Lake. This is a view from Devil's Ladder. If you've ever been to Cumberland Lake Park Campground, you climb up in behind, and the views are just gorgeous, and you can look down over the lake. But we've also been logging the landscape for 150 years. And in some cases, we're actually moving into the harvesting of like 3rd succession of trees. And absolutely, trees grow back, but the complexity of ecology and all of those things that hold the landscape together and make it resilient and healthy and strong is impacted by layers and layers of land degradation. And as I talked about before, when we cut trees out of the edges and mouths of rivers and creeks, which we used to do, and we don't do it to that same extent at all. The rules are way better, but you have to remember the entire Comox Valley was already clear cut, right? And we didn't have those rules or regulations at that point. So we totally nuked our creeks and streams by doing that. And, you know, even more recently, we've been known to build roads right up against creeks and riparian areas and just line them with riprap and break that sort of connection between land and waterways. Again, connection is so important for our health. And with technology, we're able to get higher and higher and higher up into the mountains. And as a result of that, and then when we're having more storm events and increased rain events due to climate change, we end up with things like erosion and sediment and things like that coming into the lake and causing boil water advisories. We also have some new demands on the land. Everyone wants to recreate at Comox Lake. I call this like spot the risks to Comox Lake. I figure there's tons there. It's like a campfire against a log. It's, you know, it's probably not an official campsite. There's no fire ring there, you know, some diapers in the lake. It's a good mix of like everyone out there going, I just want to have a good time on the lake. And we're not really thinking about the fact that it's both drinking water and ecologically really important. And fire is a very real risk, especially with our hotter, drier summers. It can be a real risk. But the big climate change impact in the upper watershed is going to, it comes from the change in the snow and rain dynamic. So this is from 2019 and it was showing, sorry, it's a little cut off at the bottom, but there's been, you know, we definitely are dealing with diminished snowpack on Vancouver Island. That doesn't mean we don't have a crazy snowstorm, but overall the amount of snowpack in the upper watershed is less. And as a result of that, instead of seeing a lot of snow in the winter, and I'll tell you, when we talk to old timers, they remember times where everything shut down at Comox Lake because there was so much snow, it was too hard to get out there. And that's not the reality. Like we have something called shifting baseline where we just get used to things changing. And we used to have really different winters in the Comox Valley. And now we're like, woohoo, it's awesome. There's snow up at Mount Washington and we're in a t-shirt down by the beach. But that's actually like indicative of change. So instead of all of this snow, we're going to see a lot more rain. And that may not seem like a bad thing because it's the West Coast and rain is awesome, but snow is storage and snow releases water slowly through the year and makes it available for all the reasons we need water. And so really when we shift from snow to rain, it's like having the taps on all the time and all that fresh water is flowing out to the ocean. The upper watershed is an amazing place though, and there's some really cool things happening. You know, we have rogue coho in Perseverance Creek from the hatchery drops. This is a creek that has been like, you know, like messed up in so many ways over time, but those coho still, we went down there and watched them spawn at the crook of the creek and they want to come home. Like you hear stories in the US about, you know, dams that have been removed and sockeye salmon returning after like 250 years, right? Some of the vision that we have to have is what does this landscape look like if it were healed? What if it was reconnected? Another really positive thing in the upper watershed, there's a Cumberland bat project where we're doing species at risk research and monitoring bat habitat and connecting that to how you keep the landscape healthy and happy. The regional district, so local government, bought a huge chunk of land at the east side of the lake to ensure it was never developed. It's called Coal Beach. And trying to figure out kind of how to have that be a space that people can use, but still make sure that we're protecting ecology and drinking water. But they're working on it, they're figuring it out. But the main thing is they made sure it would never be developed and never be logged again, which is amazing. And then I have to obviously, you know, I work for the Cumberland Community Forest Society and our focus is the Perseverance watershed. And so this is another beautiful thing that's happening in the upper watershed is the community is buying the watershed and all these colored spaces are what we've bought so far. And so that's happening in the upper watershed. And it's happening through using creative and fun ways as well. These are the kids who are involved in protecting lands in the upper watershed and they're in the parades. And this is all the people that were in the parade at the end celebrating. So it's, you know, it's about saving the natural environment, but it's also about doing that in a joyful way and building community at the same time. So then I'm going to jump to the middle watershed. So when we're talking about the middle watershed, I'm kind of just taking us from, you know, from the edge of Comox Lake and then as we start to move down like the rivers and the landscape. So talked about that private land legacy. This is the Bevan Trails. So the Bevan Trails have been something that's in the news because the Bevan Trails is an example where the land and the trees are owned by different people. So BC Hydro owns the land, but a logging company still owns the trees. And it's been like that for a long time. And we all go walking the trails, and then suddenly they're gonna start harvesting. And everyone's like, what do you mean that the Bevan Trails isn't a park or a protected area? But it's part of that legacy I told you about of everything being privatized. And then as companies were selling it, sometimes they would sell just the land or just the trees. And so this is a crazy example back to that Dunsmuir, history, that we end up in this situation where the community or the public doesn't actually own the trees, and we end up in a total bind. Anyone know what this is? Stoughton Falls. Yeah, exactly. So this is a total example of what I talked about in the history, is that we have people come to the valley and they're like, nobody can own the river. Like, I'm going, and except you can here. This is the crazy thing. Private owners can own rivers and creeks and can end up attempting to negotiate benefit. And that's what's happening there, is the idea of, okay, if I own land adjacent next to a space people want to use, then maybe I can develop it more, make more money off of it in exchange for saving the recreation area. And that's a really hard challenge for local government. They get pressure to do that kind of stuff, but they also feel a real deep responsibility to saving and protecting sensitive areas. So 3L, and so I'll just call it Stoughton Falls, is a total example of how hard that legacy is for our local community to deal with. Farming is a huge thing that also happens in the middle watershed. So this would be like a view from like Marsden Road. And farming also has significant impacts, and it depends on the type of farming. So there's a whole range, right, of farming that's very extractive and hard on soil and hard on water and uses lots of water. And then there's the whole other range of amazing leadership in farming and regenerative farming, and looking differently at how soil is built up and how water is used and water is extracted. But it's totally a dynamic that we're dealing with. Another thing that would have been seen historically in the middle watershed, or in the space between here and the coastline, would have been big Garry Oak ecosystems and camas bulb meadows. And camas bulbs were also a very important traditional food for the indigenous people who lived here. And turning a lot of these lands into agricultural lands, which we did in the 1800s, wiped out a lot of these Garry Oak ecosystems and camas bulb meadows. And one of those places would be exactly where Vanier is right now. So there's Garry Oaks at Vanier, right, in the Grove. And so that when you think about it, it's like, oh, that whole landscape actually used to be Garry Oak meadows and camas bulb meadows. And that's an example of how we've changed things. And all of that also changes how water flows through the landscape. But there's amazing stuff happening also in the middle watershed. This is a drone shot of the Morrison Headwaters. And the Morrison Headwaters covers about 1,000 acres between Courtney and Cumberland, so classic sort of middle watershed. And it's one of the most productive salmon streams of its size on Southeast Vancouver Island. It's epic how much incredible. So what happens is the water comes out of like a glacial moraine, so it's cold all year round, and it feeds down and then intersects with the Puntledge River. And it's amazing habitat for salmon. So they set up some critter cams also in the Morrison Headwaters, the stewardship groups that are there. And these are all the creatures that they've caught on critter cams in the Morrison Headwaters. And the Morrison Stream Keepers are an amazing group. And the picture on the left is something called the Morrison Lamprey. And it's a unique federally registered species at risk that lives in the Morrison Headwaters. And there's a really incredible group of people working with community partners from around the valley to protect this huge area of the middle watershed, because it's so critical and feeds all these other water systems. All right, how are we doing? Are we good? Okay, urban areas. So I'm going to get in, the next one is urban. So we've got upper watershed, middle watershed. Urban areas are also super impacted by climate change, by change in human settlement patterns, and that messes with water. So as we've got all this water flowing from the upper watershed through the middle watershed, doing okay through the middle watershed, making its way through some farms, some creeks, a little messed up here and there, but it's still making its way. Then it hits the edge of the urban, urban environment, or the traditional urban environment. And here's an example of a massive build out that's happening in Cumberland called Coal Valley Estates. And it's a huge amount of, it's 100% tree removal and 100% natural landscape removal, and then very wide roads, very wide paving. What I want to say is this is something that was agreed to many, many, many years ago. And I'd like to mention that I don't believe that our Cumberland Council would support this type of development today. So I want to give them like kudos. I want everyone to think, what's happening in Cumberland? Why are they letting this happen? It's a historical build out, but it's really impact the way water flows over the land. Because when we pave and we channelize water and then we send it into storm drains, what we're doing is instead of that water moving over the landscape, that water is dropping into storm drains and being channelized and then being flushed out to sea. So we're losing this whole like process that can happen where the water that's flowing down can be beneficial to the community. And the other thing that can happen in urban environments is we kind of make silly decisions about where we build sometimes. Human beings love to build on coastlines and estuaries, and this connects to the next section. But you know, when you build on a floodplain or you build in an estuary, you end up with situations like this, which we're going to see more and more if we're dealing with increasingly significant storm events. But there's also amazing stuff happening in Courtney. They were working on something called an integrated rainwater management plan. And there's they have such a great landscaping department in Courtney that may seem like it doesn't matter, but it matters. And it's all about coming up with natural ways to absorb water in the landscape instead of channelizing it. And then doing that, you can actually help things grow and improve like sort of the quality of life where we're living, create habitat corridors, and make it so that we're not just channeling all that water into storm drains, but we're actually building like greener, friendlier, healthier communities by having that water be part of the landscape. And here's another example where there's so much development pressure from above. This is Brooklyn Creek in Comox, but really amazing work has been done by Comox and the stewardship community to create a space that is a space for humans to be in, but also has potential for salmon habitat and other animals. And this is the kind of, you know, care and attention that stewardship has been putting in for a long time to the water that flows through the landscape. And we're really happy to see local governments supporting this more now too. And things can happen like, you know, years ago, if you found out there was a heron rookery in a green space somewhere, that wouldn't stop those trees from being cut down. But that's changing. And we have heron rookeries all over like Courtney, and they did an urban tree program there where they looked at where there were nice big groupings and clusters of trees that can provide meaningful habitat. So in urban areas, there's a lot of pressure from development that does really not healthy stuff to water. But I really, you know, there's some really amazing things also happening that just need our support. We need to support politicians and we need to support local government to say, you keep doing more of this. This is what we want to see happen with water. So for estuary and shoreline is our next one. I'm just going to throw up another map, and it's kind of the red line that you see here is generally thought as the estuary boundary for the Comox Valley. And then there's still shoreline north and south of this, obviously, as well. So this is a great map, and any of the stuff that's in this presentation anyone's welcome to or happy to share. And a lot of, I'll tell you for this one, and you'll see a lot of my resources have been drawn from Project Watershed, which is another incredible community organization that I'm really happy to amplify. So here's another view of the Courtney Estuary and you have the air park there on the left and Hollyhock, the marsh and the area that's protected. And then beyond you can see Kuskusum, or what I call the Old Field Sawmill site. So here's a picture of the water flowing down into the ocean again about 100 years ago. And this is the Courtney River. And this is what the Courtney River looked like. And then after it was an industrial site on the right-hand side, that's what the Courtney River looked like. So we've got the water flowing from the upper watershed into the Puntledge, through the middle watershed, around the side of Courtney. It doesn't have to flow right through Courtney, kind of through the edge. But what happened was that the steel wall was built when it was the sawmill site. And the wall basically, in some ways it's called a killing wall. It's been called a killing wall because it removed all the woody debris and rock and habitat area that allowed salmon to hide. And so just becomes like, you know, seals and can just come in and like eat the salmon. Like it doesn't give them like the reason why you want this uneven edge to a creek or river is because it creates habitat and it creates the trees over top and they keep the water cool. And there's places for fish to duck away and hide. Fish are smart. They'll do that. But on the other side, you just basically turned it into an aquarium and invited the seals in for dinner. And the reason why that site looks like that, I was thinking if you have moved here more recently, or if you were younger, you might not even remember this on the landscape. It was like 2006. I don't know if that's when they tore it down, but 2006 was definitely the end of the era. This was the field sawmill site. Huge employer in the Comox Valley, huge visual on the landscape. And this is what was removed to make that concrete area we see now, which is the Couscous site. And again, flooding is something that has happened. This is an old photo of flooding in Courtney, but the more that we mess with the shoreline, the more we mess with the edges of waterways, the more we remove these natural services that nature provides to absorb water during storms, during king tides, and then right now during climate change. Because what we do is we like build all these artificial edges to things, and it doesn't allow the landscape to absorb the water. And this is actually just beyond, I think this one's beyond Kai Bay. But one of the other things that we have a bit of a habit of doing is, trying to reinforce or protect the landscape when it's being eroded underneath by storm and again, big tides, and then what is being projected as these gradually increased sea levels. So what we'll often do is put up a whole bunch of rock and a whole bunch of barricades. But what that does is it wipes out a really important place, which is the space between the land and the ocean, these intertidal zones and coastal sand dunes and places where, again, nature lives. So we keep trying to hold back the water. That's what humans try and do. We build walls to hold back the water and channel the water. But actually what we need is to give nature space to receive the water and release the water. And it's not about fixing it. It's about backing off of the landscape and letting nature do the amazing thing that nature knows how to do. This is the salt marsh. And if you're driving along the Dyke Road, another project that I believe this is a Project Watershed one as well, which is trying to reestablish some of the things that grow along the shoreline to help be that sponge and be part of how the landscape can absorb and release water. And also important habitat as well. And the geese do a number on it, so they have to fence it off. That's why you see the fences. But again, there's amazing stuff going on, right? These creative projects, so much community engagement around the protecting of the Courtney Estuary and the Couscous site. It's from a reconciliation perspective, the involvement of Comox First Nation, the City of Courtney, and Project Watershed on this is this will be a story that will be told for a very, very long time. It's a very important and very special story for our community. And there's been a lot of creative stuff done down at the estuary too. This is a picture when a group of us actually worked with Project Watershed to bring in a show, Nomadic Tempest. It was a bit of a weird show, but it sure was cool. Like the landscape was cool. These were some roving performers, and this was the audience down on the Couscous site. We had like over 1,000 people at a time paying to see this show to contribute to Project Watershed's efforts. And even though it's this like stark and intense landscape, kind of devastating landscape, there's a certain beauty in it. And I think that beauty maybe is in the opportunity. Like we look at it and we know and understand that it can be something bigger and better for the way that the water connects to the community and the community connects to the ocean. This is such an important project for linking together, the alpine to the ocean. This is the crown jewel as far as I'm concerned. So how do we help create a functioning and climate resilient watershed? I've mentioned a few examples, I've mentioned some of the problems, but also examples of things that are happening that are really, important. It sometimes may feel like there's impending doom. The tree of life is falling over. It's going to be destroyed. This would be an example of a tree just trying to hang on. But there is a lot of very, very good work happening and work that we can all be contributing to. At the very basic level, and I've mentioned this before in the presentation, we need to pull ourselves back and retreat from water. So no matter where you live in the watershed, we need to be advocating for increased riparian buffers, increased riparian areas, and move back our settlements and our development and our recreation from water and give it the space to play this really important role, because it will persevere. These systems and these creeks will recover if we give them the space and we support them with good science and understanding what we need to do restoration. There's huge restoration potential in our community. We also need to buy land. And there's never a better time. It's the Wild West of real estate out there, folks. If we want land to be held for conservation, and if we want land to be held for water, to be that sponge, to be that space that holds water and releases it slowly, then we need to start protecting whatever land we can. And it's forests that are second growth forests. It's forests that are mature forests. It's forests sometimes that we're growing from third generation. We can grow old growth forests. We just have to leave them alone. And we need to, I don't know, be in relationship with the nature around us. So not only to be in grief about the things that are happening and the ways that climate change is impacting nature, but giving ourselves space and time to go out there and love it so that we can use that love to inform the really important work we need to do. And it's a really good counterbalance for also the anxiety and fear that we can feel around some of the changes that are happening. Because it's so beautiful. This is the, this is the Comox Valley watershed story. Here's the top of it again, and all of this water is making its way through this community that we share and connecting us all through creeks and rivers and landscapes and overland and down to the estuary. And there's no greater way to connect us all as a single community. I was really appreciated when Greta Thunberg worked on a campaign related to protect, restore, and fund. And I'd like to come back to it because I think it's something, a really important direction we can take. We need to protect our waterways and our ecological landscapes. We need to protect them. We need to restore the ones that need to be restored. And we learned so much about that in the Comox Valley because of all the harm that we've done historically. So restoration is key to what we're doing. We're not just saving here, we're restoring and regenerating landscapes. And we need to have an expectation that this will be funded by local, provincial, and federal government because it's critical to our climate resilience. So this is a picture of the Puntledge and the Browns converging, and I like to use it to represent a way that I believe our community is coming together, and that the water is a metaphor for the way that the community is merging, and those waters are coming together in a common vision that recognizes how we are all connected by water and how this interconnected landscape is so important. And then we can slowly take ourselves and zoom up and away again and look back at this blue ball floating through space and go, okay, I just need to find one watershed that's mine to take care of, to protect, to restore. When the story of climate change feels overwhelming, we can circle back and choose a place on the planet that we care for, and we can expect local leadership to help us care for it. And if everyone does that in each of their unique watersheds all over the planet, there's incredible hope and an incredible opportunity for resilience.